Welcome to the Altered Paths podcast. My name is Phil Davis. In this podcast, we will do a deep dive into the reasons for the cultural changes sweeping through the Western world. These changes extend out from the West to touch the rest of the world. Through technology and instant communication, ideas born in the West have deeply affected 5 continents in the 20th and 21st centuries. Many people express bewilderment at the rate and scope of cultural change. Cultural institutions and traditions crumble all around the world. In this podcast, we will talk about why this is happening. Change is coming by design. This is not a happenstance. Some change results from historically unprecedented cross-cultural contacts made possible through our interconnected world. Cross-pollination produces new ideas and the desire to walk on new pathways. However, large cultural shifts are being orchestrated by a cultural, technological, educational, business, and political elite. This group of people holds vast sway over the political and cultural levers of power, and they have an agenda to fundamentally transform humanity. To see what's going on in countries around the world, we need to look into the deeper reasons for these recent sweeping changes. Marxist philosophy drives much of the cultural change around us. For many decades, Marxists have operated under the surface, fomenting conflicts and plotting revolutionary change. Today, however, they feel emboldened. If you know what's going on, you can clearly read what's happening below the surface in our various cultures. In this podcast, I will try to explain some complex ideas in simple language. Hopefully, this will help you recognize why cultures around the world are fundamentally changing. As a Christian, I will reflect on what all of this means from a faith perspective. I hope you enjoy the conversation and the journey. To see how we got to where we are today, we need to go back to 1848, to London, where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published their landmark political tract, the Communist Manifesto. Why do we start with Marx and Engels? Because these two late 20-year-olds presented a framework for all of history that exerts a tremendous historical, political, and cultural force extending to our present decade. Namely, they argued that all of history is a process of class struggle between those who own property and those who do not. In technical terms, Marx lumps people who own property into a class and names them the bourgeois. Marx then places everyone else, that is, people who don't own property, into the proletariat. According to the website Marxist.org, and I quote, "By the bourgeois is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labor. By the proletariat, the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live." However, it's precisely these generalized terms that get slippery. Who owns property? Is it the rich factory owner like Friedrich Engels' father? In Marx's book, Das Kapital, the proletarian is anyone who owns capital, meaning property that enables someone to make more money and thus to produce society. Or to say this differently, property that someone doesn't need to use immediately to live and survive. All other people he placed into another class, the proletariat. Thus, Marx and Engels declare that history revolves around a class struggle between these two classes, property owners and laborers, or the bourgeois and the proletariat. However, as revolutionaries in the 20th century applied Marx's ideas, the line separating the two classes kept shifting downward to ridiculous levels. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx portrays the moneyed class as factory owners. However, the level of property one needed to own to be part of the proletariat fell considerably. For example, in Cambodia in 1975, the Khmer Rouge seized families' woks and cooking utensils, which made common people dependent on the local cadre for their daily food. To own a simple metal wok placed a common mother in the class of the bourgeois, since she owned property. Of course, the Khmer Rouge seized property as a crass ploy to seize power over people's lives. Without cooking utensils, people would starve unless they completed their daily work assignments. Power operates underneath all Marxist programs. While Marxists claim that revolution will bring about universal true freedom, history shows that exactly the opposite results. People lose freedom and sink into slavery. Others disappear or suffer in re-education camps, while corpses pile up in killing fields. As we will see in this podcast, Marxist offers an exact reversal of reality. It presents a theology that is the negative image of Christianity, and it is a driving force in our world today. With that introduction, let's take a look at the spark that lit the fuse of so many political revolutions, the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels write, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the power of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter, Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies." Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where are the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? We notice that Marx and Engels start their manifesto with the image of a demon, the demon of communism. Against this demon, all the European political powers gather to drive out this specter, including Pope Pius IX in Rome and Tsar Nicholas I in Russia. Marx and Engels mention other enemies of his communist group, such as French radicals and German police spies, expressing their paranoia, born from a view of reality as two opposing forces fighting in a winner-take-all battle. Marx and Engels claim that, and I quote, "It is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself." They call the idea of a communist demon a nursery tale, but I think it's instructive that the very first image that came to Marx's mind as he sat down to write his manifesto was the demonic. We will see as this podcast goes along that this may not have been coincidental. Marx and Engels, though, clearly state that the communists from various countries who gathered in London in 1848 wanted to publish their plans. Thus, the Manifesto begins with Marx's view of reality, that is, his ontology, as constant struggle. Marx writes, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Marx and Engels announce that all of human history should be understood as a struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed. They write, "Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." Several things stand out in this statement. Marx and Engels reduce all human history to a struggle between masters and slaves. In this sense, Marx follows his teacher Hegel, who argued that there are things that slaves know that their masters do not know. The struggle continues endlessly throughout time between two contending classes. This implies a constant battle over power occurring either publicly or subversively in society. One class eventually wins, which brings about one of two results. Either, quote, a revolutionary reconstitution of society, that is, a fundamental transformation of society, or, again I quote, the common ruin of the contending classes. Thus, Marx and Engels argue that either society is fundamentally reconstituted when the revolutionaries prevail, or both oppressors and oppressed are ruined if the conservatives win. Marx and Engels then recount an interpretation of history in which one party determines social development by seizing the means of production. The villain in their story is the bourgeoisie, who seize the means of production by accumulating capital. Marx and Engels write, "The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones." Again, we see a picture of class conflict. According to Marx and Engels, the bourgeois, or property class, in the mid-19th century established, and I quote, "new classes, new conditions of oppression, and new forms of struggle." If anything, they claim, the bourgeoisie found new, more effective and efficient ways to oppress the working class. For the sake of time, I wish to simplify their tale of history. In general, Marx and Engels argue that the bourgeois class slowly usurped power from humble beginnings as medieval serfs to chartered town burghers to international traders to titans of industrial production. A division of labor in industrial production and the establishment of the world market enabled the bourgeoisie to conquer for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway over all of society. Marx and Engels argue, and again I quote, that the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part in history. The bourgeoisie, again I quote, put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations and drowned religious fervor, chivalrous enthusiasm, and Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. That is to say, the property class destroyed all previous relations between a lord and his serfs, all chivalric customs, any sentimentality, by imposing a heartless calculation on all human relations through market forces. Marx and Engels write, the bourgeoisie dissolved, and I quote, numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, end of quote, and established in their place a single freedom of free trade. Thus, in place of prior freedoms, the bourgeoisie, and I quote, substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Here we see a Marxist trope. History is the story of individuals finding more effective ways to enslave people. Therefore, the Communist Manifesto announces a new way for workers to free themselves, through revolution. Marx and Engels argue that the world market draws people and nations into its orbit like iron filings to a magnet. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. This idea is a commonplace for us today. Within my lifetime, I've seen black and white televisions replaced by color televisions, the introduction and obsolescence of videotape recorders, the advent of high-definition television, and now large-screen flat TVs. We think, of course, of the cliché of the buggy whip maker put out of business by the introduction of the gas-powered automobile. Marx and Engels correctly saw that the introduction of new industries drives competition among nations. However, they took the point further, and I quote, the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. Now, obviously, we would not talk about other nations or people in these terms today. However, this was the 19th century, and perhaps Marx and Engels are speaking ironically. In any event, they continue, the cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. We hear, once again, the language of war. Marx and Engels equate inexpensive goods with heavy artillery battering down obstinate peoples. This language of oppression appears again. The bourgeoisie employs all the instruments of production with which this oppressive class compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves. Then Marx and Engels employ religious language, and I quote, in one word, it creates a world after its own image. By seizing the instruments of production, the property class, or the bourgeoisie, employ godlike power over society, drawing all nations into civilization. Marx and Engels claim that the capitalists force barbarian nations to capitulate. Capitalists compel nations to adopt the bourgeois mode of production on the pain of extinction. The bourgeois forced nations to participate in its mode of production, that is capitalism, which means to become bourgeois themselves. Then, in an oblique reference to Genesis chapter 1, the bourgeois, as God, creates a world of consumers after its own image, as God created man, male and female, in his own image. Marx and Engels were atheists who did not believe in God, so they accuse people with money or property of seizing divine power over their fellow men and women. Thus, they have become the ultimate oppressors. According to this manifesto, the bourgeoisie usurped enormous power over people by emptying the countryside of villagers and concentrating them in the cities. Thus, Marx and Engels write, the bourgeoisie has created enormous cities, greatly increasing the urban population as compared with the rural population. In fact, cities like London and Manchester expanded greatly during the Industrial Revolution as people sought employment in factories and textile mills. The bourgeois used the sheer power of industrial might to subjugate nature's forces, and I quote, to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electronic telegraphs, and the clearing of whole continents for cultivation. Marx and Engels claimed that the bourgeoisie had seized divine-like powers over nature, people, and civilization. However, the forces of production that they held would eventually be their undoing. The dialectic of history would turn against the property owners, for the means of production they employed would work against them. Marx and Engels write, a similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. Marx and Engels claim that, although bourgeois society sits at the top of the heap, exercising godlike powers over society, they are headed for a great fall. The powerful rich barons of industry have unleashed forces they cannot control. For a second time, Marx and Engels express a demonic theme in this manifesto. Here they employ the image of a sorcerer who has lost his dominance over the powers of hell, because he called up, and I quote, the netherworld by his spells. Marx and Engels claim that in a similar way, the bourgeoisie have called up powers of production that will destroy them. Society, and I quote, has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, which Marx and Engels equate to a magician calling up a spirit to appear by means of a magical ritual. Unfortunately, the bourgeois cannot control this demon. The demon is the modern productive forces which will revolt against the commercial class. In this case, the problem is one of overproduction. Modern productive forces will revolt against modern conditions of production and the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule, as Marx and Engels wrote. Notice again the assumption of dominance and subjection, of rule and subservience, of control and destruction. Marx and Engels predict a coming crisis that would destroy the bourgeoisie, an epidemic of overproduction. The creative forces of industry have produced a crisis that puts society back into a state of momentary barbarism, in their words, wherein, and I quote, there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, and too much commerce. The bourgeoisie seized the modern productive forces. However, these powers of the netherworld now place the rich in chains. Marx and Engels write, the productive forces, no longer then to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property, on the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The productive forces the bourgeoisie have grasped now turn against them and place the capitalists in chains, according to Marx. The demon revolts against its masters. I want to briefly talk about some things that are difficult at first to understand. If you've not studied philosophy, you might find the next few minutes challenging. However, the ideals I'll share are crucial to understand why cultures are changing around the world. To understand what Marx is doing and why he exerts so much influence, we need to know something about the philosophy undergirding his political, economic, and social plans. Marx was a student of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, an influential German philosopher who greatly influenced continental philosophy. We can summarize Hegel's philosophical approach as dialectical idealism. Hegel argued that history is driven by spirit with a capital S, seeking to understand itself. To simplify Hegel's argument, spirit with a capital S takes the role of God in Hegel's program. According to Hegel, spirit, or God, faces a problem. God needs to realize God's self. Thus, God seeks to know God's self. God begins this process by creating humankind to reason, to learn, and to grow in understanding. Everything participates in the unity of spirit, which incorporates everything that exists. Thus, man, as male and female, is other to God, while being part of God, for God is all that exists. Spirit's problem is that spirit doesn't realize itself or understand itself completely. Here people come to spirit's aid. As we learn and grow, we reason about life and think every thought that is possible to think. We think, and spirit thinks through us. Since mankind is part of the all that is spirit, all with a capital A. Thus, God learns and develops through history. This process of thinking continues until spirit, with a capital S, comes to a complete realization of God's self through people who have realized everything that can possibly be learned or thought. Someone has summarized this process as thought, thinking, thinking, thinking. In the end, spirit or God realizes itself through an historical process of human thought. Hegel was an idealist, and the philosophical process he followed is called a dialectic speculative process. The postmodern French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard called this the speculative genre of discourse, or a speculative way of speaking, writing, and thinking. Speculation follows a three-step process. For Hegel, it starts with spirit, or with what is known. However, with spirit, with a capital S, for spirit to progress in its quest towards self-realization, spirit needs to create something other than itself. Thus, spirit creates man, who thinks alongside spirit. A dialectic or conversation ensues between two interlocutors. These conversationalists sometimes agree and sometimes disagree with each other. However, through this process, humanity helps spirit to reason and come to realize new truths. The dialectic or conversation results in a synthesis of new knowledge, according to the rules of the speculative discourse. People sometimes condense speculative reasoning into three steps: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Here, thesis represents what someone already knows or assumes to be true about reality. Someone challenges this notion with another idea that claims to represent the truth. As the two conversationalists banty their opposing ideas against one another, a new synthesis or realization about the truth emerges. Marx appreciates Hegel's approach, but found all this to be too abstract, too ideal. It remains too philosophical. Marx believed the point of philosophy was not to build elaborate theories. Rather, the point is to change history. So Marx took Hegel's philosophy and applied it to history. In the mid-19th century, Marx concentrated on the processes of production, since he argued that these affect and change humanity and society. People often refer to Marx's philosophy as dialectical materialism. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx writes about the changes industrialization made on European society. He argues that the people who control the processes of industry have unleashed demonic forces from the netherworld that will soon destroy them. Marx writes, and I quote, "A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule." Simply said, Marx and Engels predicted that the enormous powers the steam engine, electricity, and factory production would turn demonically against the industry barons who subjected nature's forces to their will to produce goods for exchange, for their desire to become rich. Marx and Engels prophesied that these productive forces would bring destruction through the, in their words, epidemic of overpopulation. As a result, and I quote, society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. Why would it seem that industry and commerce would be destroyed? Marx and Engels give the reason. They write, because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, and too much commerce. Marx and Engels argued that the forces of production, which enabled a few to develop the conditions of bourgeois property, have become too powerful, and once they break free from their fetters, would bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society. This unleashing of productive forces would endanger the existence of bourgeois property. To overcome the restrictions of overproduction, the bourgeoisie would employ two tactics: the conquest of new markets and the more thorough exploitation of old markets. Marx and Engels claim that the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. Simultaneously, the rich oppressor class of the bourgeoisie, and I quote, has also called into existence the men who are to wield their weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. Marx views the proletariat as, and I quote, the modern working class of laborers. These people, again I quote, live only so long as they find work. According to the Manifesto, again I quote, these laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity like every other article of commerce. Thus, Marx and Engels view employees as economic slaves who are reduced to the inhuman level of a commodity. They write about a factory worker, and I quote, he becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. As a commodity, the workman is paid only on the level of, and I quote, subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. That is, his employer will only pay as much as is required to keep the workman alive and able to raise a family. From the feudal workshop of the craftsman, modern industry has substituted, and I quote, the great factory of the industrial capitalist. By organizing large numbers of workers and herding them into factories, the industrial capitalists have enslaved workers to the bourgeois class and the bourgeois state. Marx and Engels write, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the induvial bourgeois manufacturer himself. The enslavement of workers to factory wages gives birth to another class of people. According to Marx and Engels, the proletariat is born in its struggle with the bourgeoisie. Beginning as a struggle with individual employees, the contest attracts other workers in the factory until operatives of one trade confront, in Marx's words, the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. The proletariat strikes out against the instruments of production, and I quote, they destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze, and they seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workman of the Middle Ages. This, in coherent mass of laborers coalesce and concentrate in greater masses as its strength grows. Marx and Engels longed for the centralization of, and I quote, numerous class struggles into one national struggle between classes. They desired a revolution that would utterly destroy 19th century society. Marx and Engels lay out the communists' plan at the end of their manifesto. They declare that the communists, and I quote, never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. In their war against property owners, the communists would pursue total destruction. Marx and Engels state, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. The manifesto places a target on the entire social and political structure. The whole political and social system must be torn down. Lest you think I'm overstating the case, Marx and Engels clearly state at the conclusion of their manifesto that communists, and I quote, openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Forcible overthrow means the violent use of force. Thus, Marx and Engels threaten, and I quote, let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. Here we arrive at the heart of what's changing societies around the world. To fundamentally transform society, Marxists need to completely destroy society. They aim at a worldwide revolution, so they seek to overthrow every political, social, and cultural system in every country on the planet. This is why you see the cancellation of a people's history as Mao accomplished in China during the Cultural Revolution, and what leftists are attempting to do in the West today. Statues must be torn down, history books rewritten, and families shredded so that Big Brother can seize control over society. Marx and Engels counseled the, and I quote, forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. However, Gramsci and Mao taught that societies can be undermined in far more subtle ways. Remember that Marx is a dialectical materialist. He believed that the current order of society, or the thesis, needed to be contradicted by its opposite, or antithesis. Through the revolutionary clash between these two opposing social systems, revolution would ignite. The Marxist promise is that this will inevitably lead to a new and better society, to a utopia. Marxists have tried this repeatedly in history. However, the promised paradise never comes. Rather, in the previous century, over 100 million people died on the Marxist road to nowhere. The Communist Manifesto ends with a stirring battle cry. It's the line most people remember. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. But is that true? An honest reader of history would beg to differ. People took up the program outlined in the manifesto, and millions of their countrymen became enslaved to tyrannical communist dictatorships, or stood in gulags and killing fields. What might a Christian think about this manifesto? First, we should acknowledge that some Christians have embraced these ideas. Especially in South America, some Christians embrace liberation theology, a Marxist form of Christianity. Gustavo Gutierrez wrote his landmark book, A Theology of Liberation, in 1971. Gutierrez notes in his introduction that, and I quote, "This book is an attempt at reflection based on the gospel and the experiences of men and women committed to the process of liberation in the oppressed and exploited land of Latin America. It is a theological reflection born of the experience of shared efforts to abolish the current unjust situation and to build a different society, freer and more human." End of quote. Here we see a Marxist framework through which he interprets Christian theology. Latin American men and women are the oppressed who need liberation, which entails the ending of the current society to build a more human, that is, communist society. Gutierrez argues that theology has, quote, "a prophetic function," but he seems perhaps influenced more deeply by Marxist philosophers like Antonio Gramsci and communist killers like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Mao Zedong than by the Old Testament prophets and Christian tradition. While Gutierrez shows impressive scholarly chops, he clearly allows Marxist philosophy to govern his interpretation of Christian faith. I believe this is a dead end. Jesus said that we would recognize a tree by the fruit it bears. Matthew 7:16. Many revolutionaries tried to establish new communist societies during the 20th century. These zealots promised coming social paradise. However, in most cases, these social experiments ended in nightmares for the common people. Over 100 million people died at the hands of dictators like Mao, who promised that his great leap forward would entail 3 years of hard work, which would produce 10,000 years of happiness. Instead, Mao's experiment produced the greatest famine in human history. One could add other names to this list: Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, the Kim family, Fidel Castro, and so on. This murderer's row produced more human suffering in the bloodiest century in human history. They all promised a new form of heaven on earth that would never come. Again, Jesus' warning applies. You will know them by their fruits. It could not have ended any other way, for the whole approach leads to chaos. Marx preached an historical dialectical materialism. To say this simply, current society must be opposed through a violent overthrow of the existing social and political order of things. Marx and Engels openly declared that the communists could only attain their ends by, quote, "the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions." This necessarily pits them against the God of creation, who brings the whole project of creation by bringing order to chaos at the beginning of Genesis. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a God who organizes chaos to create a world that flourishes. God overcomes chaos to bring life, peace, and rest. Communists, however, revel in the destruction of all existing social conditions. Their spirit resonates with the heart of Satan, who comes to kill, steal, and destroy. John 10:10. We saw that spirit break out with abandon on the streets of American cities in 2020. Riots organized by Black Lives Matter celebrated the destruction of property in nights filled with broken glass and fire, resulting in approximately $2 billion of damage. A spirit lies close to the surface in many of the cultural movements troubling American and Western societies today. It's a spirit of dissension. Marxists view dissension as the spring that moves the engine of cultural transformation. They use confrontation and intimidation to push society toward their end goal, which is the tearing down of all existing social conditions so that a new society can emerge. The Bible warns us to avoid such people. The Apostle Paul lists these sins among the acts of the flesh in Galatians 5:19-21. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. These behaviors sound like the tactics used in leftist actions. Too often, mostly peaceful protests aim to divide people in a society to create dissension and factions. Paul again counsels the Roman believers to avoid such people. He wrote, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them. For such people are not serving our Lord Christ, but their own appetites. By smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the minds of naive people." Romans 16, verses 17 and 18. I would argue that Marx was such a man. His entire work served his own appetite. Marx grifted off of his father, begged money from his mother, and eventually lived off of Engels's fortune. Marx's mother and his wife both remarked that he should start earning some capital rather than just writing about it. His wife Jenny had to go around begging shopkeepers to extend the family credit so they could live. But Marx certainly knew how to turn a phrase, incite people to violence, and light a powder keg that continues to explode. The Apostle Paul clearly stated that we should correct people who sow division in the church. He gave these instructions to Titus. Warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with them. You may be sure that such people are warped and sinful. They are self-condemned. Titus 3:10 and 11. Of course, people should stand for justice when others are treated unjustly. We must hold a place for the church's prophetic witness when individuals, neighborhoods, societies, and nations fall into sin, but Jesus' warning still stands. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Matthew 7, verses 15 through 20. Marx promised a workers' paradise, but his manifesto brought destruction to over 100 million people's lives. When pressed on why paradise has not come, Marxists will say that his ideas have never been tried, meaning no one has done it yet. But they hold to their conviction that utopia will come if they only do the work. As Jesus said, however, a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. It's time to cut down the tree of Marxism and throw it into the fire. to place it in the ash heap of history. In the next podcast, we will look again at the Communist Manifesto. We will consider the political and social program Marx and Engels laid out. This will help us understand what is happening today in our society. We will more clearly see what is driving the cultural changes around us that seem only to be accelerating. Thanks for listening to Altered Paths with Phil Davis.